Welcome to Faithcast, a Faith in the Forest ministry. Be sure to hit that notification bell to stay up to date on great new content. Now, here is your host, Pastor Keith.
So welcome to Faithcast. Here's the deal. We didn't know whether or not we were going to be able to broadcast this weekend or not because I'm not home. I'm not at the studio. So Kathy came up with the idea that she was going to try and use her phone as a hotspot and we were going to record out in the National Forest. But doing some research on it and talking to a couple different people, we found out that that's easier said than done. Easy. So I was joking because one of my best friends and my cousin Brad lives within spitting distance of the National Forest and just down the road from where we were camping. And I joked that I was going to sit in his parking or in his driveway and broadcast this morning, and he took it serious and said, "Why don't you just come in the house?" And so I left the campsite this morning, came to Brad's house, and so we were on location. However, I thought that Brad was going to be my special guest this morning. But just like Kathy, he's on the other side of the camera. So we're going to jump right into it. I do not have scripture this morning. When I decide to use scripture when we're doing the Faithcast thing is going to be when it actually fits into the specifically what we're talking about. And I don't want to try and shoehorn scripture in every single week when we're trying to look at how faith has always sort of intertwined in our secular life. And so to look at it that way and then start out with the traditional, let us start with scripture and prayer and the stuff that becomes dogmatic religion, we're just going to stay away from that because this is all supposed to be about a conversation about music. The idea is not me pushing religion, but for all of you guys listening to realize that faith has been intertwined in your lives longer than you realize because that's how we started as a nation. That's how we started as human beings. You know, it's interesting. I was just reading, I'm not getting political. This is interesting. Brad is standing exactly where Kathy does when I'm broadcasting. It's like I'm looking up going, okay, today I'm just talking to Brad instead of, yeah, sit down, man. Sit down, relax. I promise I won't put you on camera. So anyhow, I'm not getting political, but I like to read both sides of the political spectrum, the Republican, Democrat. It'd be nice if we didn't have political parties. We could all just talk about issues. But I was reading Ben Shapiro's book, The Right Side of History. And it was interesting because he's talking about it. All he's talking about is how our Christian Judeo beliefs started from the beginning of time and have influenced everything we've done. And then how people have looked at different, once we got into the Enlightenment and, then you look at like Charles Darwin, how different philosophical thoughts have affected things over the time. And then it gets to where we are today with this idea of self-esteem. And I don't want to talk about all that, although I could do an entire episode just on that, but that would have nothing to do with the gospel and rock and roll. What does have to do with the gospel and rock and roll is the idea that Judeo-Christian beliefs have always been intertwined in human history. And that's just undeniable fact. I mean, that's outside of the Bible, that's historically documented. When people say we started as a Christian nation and argue we didn't start as a Christian nation, both of those arguments are right depending on which way you want to look at what we started as, So it's always been there. And so when music started to develop and musical genres started to develop, some sense of Judeo-Christian beliefs were already sitting there. So early rock and roll really comes from early gospel. It comes from the early slave plantations. I mean, it comes from the slave music, a lot of our rock and roll. That's just fact. There's no way to... And I look at that and I think, well, for how horrific and how bad slavery was, I still look at Scripture and says, God will use all things to His glory. And so out of the nastiness, the thing that we look back in history and wish it had never happened, it did. We can't go back and change that. And yet some incredible music came out of it. And here's what was really interesting about this when I started to look at the beginning of musical genres and how much gospel played into it, right? So last week I said that this popped into my head like 5 or 6 years ago. I got to thinking about this. And I was thinking, man, what a novel thought, to think about the songs that I had been singing, right? So you and I had the conversation about Leonard Skinner and the number of times that Skinner songs mentioned faith blatantly. So I thought, well, this is pretty cool. And I thought, man, what am I going to do for research on such an original thought? Then I started doing research and realized, well, this is not very original of a thought, because there have been all sorts of things brought out. I'm just going to read this for a minute, right? So capping a 16-month project funded by the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, WXPN will debut a 4-part radio documentary, and this was on February 4th of 2019, sharing the stories of the early beginnings and influence of gospel music in like how it affects music all over. I was like, oh, well, somebody's already sort of done this, but which is cool. I mean, it's really neat that this has been looked at in many different ways. In fact, as we were setting up this morning, I told Brad that I even found a Facebook page that if you want to go look it up, because you're on Facebook when we get done today, the Facebook page is the top 100 classic rock songs with religious content meta list. Who decided they were the top 100 songs is, I guess, whoever sat there making that list, and how they decided it was the top 100. But this has been looked at in many different ways. So when we look at the idea of a musical genre, right? This was from Top Musical Genres, TwilightBroadcasters.com, and this is how they, in defining genres, this is how they define rock. Rock and roll, or rockabilly, originated in the United States before developing into many different styles of rock, starting into the 1960s. Elvis Presley is hailed as the king of rock and roll and will forever be remembered for his contributions. In the early 1950s, the roots of rock and roll form, and it is heavily influenced by the blues, rhythm and blues, country, electric blues, and folk. All right, so rock is affected by all of these genres that already existed. We would all agree with that. That's pretty accurate to say, right? But if we take that back even further, and this is from musicmap.info, which is pretty cool. If you go and look at it, it actually brings up this really cool looking sort of genealogy map of music. And when you click on each genre, it talks about how it's influenced, and they sort of sit next to each other like every genre. So, the very first popular music genres came from a variety of influences, but the foundations were laid in the United States. Before blues and jazz developed themselves, a number of proto-genres responsible for that developed. Were already known and popular throughout the country: ragtime, stride, jug bands, and skiffle. But the most important one was gospel. Gospel evolved from the fragile voice, and this is what I was telling you earlier, fragile voice from the black slaves into an undeniably huge genre with many subgenres. Gospel shakes off pretty fast its racial dimension. Black and white join hand in hand to sing the song of God. All right, so even they say, right, when you look at all of these genres, it's all going to go back to gospel, which starts in the early slavery period. And so it's already intertwined. And so when we jump ahead and we look at that, let me read off a few names for you here. Oh, wait, I'm going to start with one. This is really interesting, because gospel music itself was invented by the Reverend Tommy Dorsey. And when I say it was invented by it, he took the song Precious Lord, Take My Hand, and took it from just being in the churches, in a purely religious song, and brought it into more of a secular, and made it popular. It just became a popular, and thus the idea of gospel as a genre was created, right? And that was like in the 1930s, actually 1932. Sorry, I'm jumping around on my notes because I want this all to make sense. And I guess this is one of the things I got to say, and I should have started out this episode with it, is there's no chronological order to how we're doing each of the episodes. Aside from, I felt like the very first episode, we need to say, here's what this whole thing's about. The second episode, this one, is, okay, here's where it all started. Like, we have to understand the history of it. And then after this, when we start moving on, it's really going to be more of an individual aspect of looking at different music and looking more specifically at artists that put gospel, or put Christian music, put faith music. I don't want to say Christian. Put some semblance of faith. In fact, I could almost say religion, because next week, I'll tell you before we leave, next week we're going to talk about an anti-religious song. But so when I'm looking at this, I'm trying not to be all chronologically correct. I just want to put it all together and say, here's the facts. So going back to, I talked about the WXPN radio program. One of the things that they said in this was, it unfurls the histories of modern music, reminding us that the soulful sounds of Ray Charles, the earnest wailing of Aretha Franklin, and the bluesy rock and roll of Elvis Presley all owe themselves to the sounds of gospel. And so in looking at a couple other songs, if we go back to, I'm just going to mention 3 pure gospel singers, and then I'm going to mention like the artists that we know were influenced by them, right? Because this is the beginning of rock and roll. An artist by the name of Sam Cooke, he had a band called the Soul Stirrers. They took their sacred music into a secular concept, just like the Reverend Dorsey did, right? And the music of Sam Cooke directly influenced Al Green, Aretha Franklin, and Ray Charles, what I just mentioned, right? So then, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. You ever heard of her?
Oh, yes.
Right? So she's considered to be the original female rocker. Came out of the gospel, and she directly influenced Elvis and Johnny Cash. She could play, right? She didn't play that way, though. She wasn't left-handed. There you go. Brad's off camera doing like air guitar. Brad and I are both left-handed, so we do air guitar like all the Muppets. You ever notice all the Muppets and Jim Henson are all left-handed guitarists? Yes. All right, and one other one, Marion Williams, not as well known, but I mean, she just had an incredible voice. In fact, Little Richard was directly influenced, one of the people directly influenced by Marion Williams, and they say that that screech that he did, that Little Richard did, that came directly from Marion Williams. Like that was an ode to her. And James Brown and Otis Redding, all directly related to Marion Williams. So here we have like all of these original artists that most of us have never heard of. We would probably never sit like I can't think of a time that I'm gonna sit down and go, yeah, I want to listen to some Sam Cooke music. You know, if I'm not looking at his name on a piece of paper right now, I'm never thinking about Sam Cooke. I didn't know much of anything about Marion Williams until I started doing some research on it.
I've never heard of her.
And honestly, I knew very little about Sister Rosetta other than the fact that she was an incredible guitarist. Yeah. I mean, and especially because of the time frame that she was, right? This was before women's rights. This was before, before, I mean, the race barrier was still, I mean, she had everything going against her, and boom.
Did it anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, hey, God can use all things. That's, So I was going to ask you this morning, Brad, because I know I stop in your office once in a while, and you're always listening to bluegrass music now.
Yes.
Which, right? And we can say that bluegrass has a beginning in... We could easily trace bluegrass back to gospel, right? Because bluegrass comes from country, which comes from... You know how bluegrass music got its name? Why it's called bluegrass music?
I have heard, but I don't remember.
Okay, so... And some people might think this is an irrelevant topic for today because we're talking about, rock and roll, but it's how closely knit so many of the artists are across the genres, and then the relationships they have. So Earl Flatt, Lester Scruggs, right? Flatt and Scruggs. Did I get their first names right in the right order? Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs, right? Who most people wouldn't know unless I said, the Ballad of Jed Clampett, Foggy Mountain Breakdown. They started out as backup musicians for Bill Monroe, right? And then decided to go off on their own. And so Bill Monroe's backup band was called the Bluegrass Boys because of coming from Kentucky. So this was their Kentucky bluegrass sound. But it wasn't called bluegrass then. It was just the sound that Bill Monroe had with this mandolin, that this different sort of, it's country music, but it was different. It wasn't even, at that point, it wasn't really even country music. It was like old-timey music. You know, it was like, you have to go all the way back to like the Carter family.
Folk music.
Folk, it was yes, sort of a folk music. And you got to be careful about saying folk music, because then most people will think about, like,
then you're going
like into like Woody Guthrie and you know, then into Bob Dylan, you know, because most people relate folk music to like the 1960s anti-establishment music movement. But so in this early genre of Americana music,
there you go, perfect.
that was that. You know, before genres were really getting labeled, Flat and Scruggs left the Bluegrass Boys and started touring on their own, and created not just a rift, but a feud between Flat and Scruggs and Bill Monroe. Bill Monroe, I guess, was not...
He was not an easy man to
work with. Not an easy man to work with. That's a good way to put it. And so when Flat and Scruggs would be performing, you know, of course, they were incredible musicians, and people knew them because they started to become stars in their own right, just as backup musicians to Bill Monroe. And so then when they're doing their own concerts, people wanted to hear the music they'd been playing when they were with Bill Monroe, but they knew they couldn't say, people wouldn't scream out and say, play, you know, can you play that Bill Monroe song, or can you play, right? It's like even the fans back then knew that there was a feud, and you just don't mention it, right? But they wanted Flat and Scruggs to do the stuff when, some of the stuff that they had come up with when they were the backup instruments for Bill Monroe. So they started screaming on stage, hey, play your bluegrass music, in reference to being the Bluegrass Boys. And so it's interesting that Bill Monroe gets credit for being the father of bluegrass music, but it never got named until Flat and Scruggs went out on their own, and Bill Monroe got to name a musical genre for being a jerk. Like,
right.
That's basically how, and he didn't even name it, the fans did. But so, you know, I have a list here of like all these different genres and where they go to. And here's one thing I thought was interesting. It's like, what even is a musical genre? So they talk about the emotional feeling of the song, the energy level of the song, and the song's emotional depth level. I don't know if I agree with that. We could go into a complete debate just on that. I mean, whoever came up with this was their, you know. But the first thing they say is, keep in mind that musical genres often overlap, since music is a creative field. So the blues originated in the Deep South with African Americans. Deep and soulful sounds and enchanting lyrics capture the attention of the audience. They say the year of the genre's conception can be placed at around the late 1800s. And it's based on the work songs, spirituals, folk music, field hollers, and chants. I think that definition takes a little bit of a broad spectrum to call all that blues.
You could actually trace back to Africa.
Yeah.
Brought music with them when they came.
Yeah, so that's a pretty broad. So then, you know, it goes down. It talks these other dance and electronic dance, jazz, and then rock, which I read earlier, and then heavy metal, which they say developed mainly in the United Kingdom. But it's interesting, being based, like many other genres, on blues, or more specifically blues rock. And this is interesting, because it talks about heavy metal as the top genre, but then it breaks it down into like blues rock, acid rock, and psychedelic rock. And I don't know that psychedelic rock. This is an interesting article that now I just want to sit here and tear this article apart. But the basis of what I did like about this article was they all will acknowledge that it goes back to gospel. I mean, it all goes back to that early. This is interesting. Okay, so Brad, we can clarify right now. Country music or country and western originated in the southern United States. That's not true. Before the 1940s, it was hillbilly music. So when they say the southern United States, you start thinking like Texas and Arkansas, you know, the Ozark, you know, right? But hillbilly music started in Virginia and West Virginia, and northern Tennessee. I mean, hillbilly music started in Bristol, Tennessee. That's where it started. That's where the Carter family had their first recordings.
Yes.
And, before then, that was all music that A.P. Carter was traveling around stealing music from everybody he could find, right?
And then having the ladies record it.
Yes. And he would, and then he would place music, and he had oh my gosh, and I feel bad, and I'm going to make sure I come up with this name. You hold me to this. Because there was an African-American fellow that traveled with him and for the life of me, I cannot remember his name right now, and I should, because he is such an influence into what the Carter family did and how he got
him indoors that he wouldn't have got in without him.
Yeah, and this is why this is. Don't sit there and try and think of it right now too much. Even though you have like electronics over there, you can sit there and Google it off stage. So this is why I brought this up. The guy said that you listen to bluegrass music now, even though growing up you are highly influential, and right, you're the reason I listen to Leonard Skinner. It's your fault, right? But I remember like you were big into ELO and David Bowie, and right, you listen to a lot of rock, right? So I'm still challenging you to think back on some of the songs and go, oh hey, wait, they did mention faith. Because in coming episodes, we're going to talk about the individual aspect of listening to rock music and having faith influence on it. But I brought up the idea that you listen to bluegrass music now because, well, it's such a fantastic genre. But I'm bringing it back to this very beginning of A.P. Carter. It took me a whole half-hour episode to come full circle, all the way back around to A.P. Carter and hillbilly music. Oh, and here's the teaser for the chapel at Tidiot Creek. We don't have this set in stone yet, but the idea of the hillbilly, there's actually a movie out now, a documentary called Hillbilly, that I'm hoping to get a hold of, and as soon as this coronavirus restrictions are lifted, I want to do an evening of hillbilly understanding at the Grange Hall. So prayerfully that will be happening. So early hillbilly music came from A.P. Carter and somebody would type in the other gentleman that we will give credit to next week. Traveling around the countryside. A.P. would just leave Sarah at home to work take care of the home, and he would just travel around and get all these old field songs and work songs and church songs and any lyrics he could get a hold of, and if he didn't know all the lyrics, he would fill them in. And then this other gentleman, they would put music to it, and they would come up with it, and then again, they would take it back, and the girls would then sing them. And it was from these early songs that developed this hillbilly music, which became this Americana music, which became country music, which, when you look at how close, now you're talking from Bristol, Tennessee to Nashville to Memphis, right, is a short drive, respectively. And in that short drive, right, you're going from this pure hillbilly music, and once you get into Memphis, now you're into more of the blues, Delta music. That's where Elvis comes from. Mm-hmm. And to call Elvis the king of rock and roll, and yet it all came from. And then I said this last week, right? Elvis won 3 Grammys, and all 3 of them were for gospel songs. So now once you're on the Mississippi, you're heading north and south, and now you're influenced by the music of New Orleans and Chicago, which I know Chicago is not set on the Mississippi, but that's my north and south line. Sure. And really, we could take it to Chicago, because now we could go way off on a tangent about the Grand Ole Opry and the fact that it actually started in Chicago, and that. It's way off on a tangent, sort of, but the idea of this whole episode is that all of these musical genres intertwine with one another. Everybody influences off everybody else. And that's why I shared, partly to say you listen to bluegrass music now, but you also listen to classic rock, and you listen to these other genres, because some of them, I don't know how to label some of them. Because it's hard to list David Bowie as classic rock. He's sort of his own.
It's kind of an individual.
Yeah. but you listen to Johnny Cash, and but all of these genres play into, they all intertwine.
Johnny Cash is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because of his influence over everybody.
See, I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. See, aren't you glad I had Brad as a special guest today as I invaded his home? So next week, I want to step aside from this. I want to jump ahead, and I want to give everybody a teaser, because we're going to come back to this. I have a feeling this series is going to go on longer than I thought. I thought I'd do probably 6 weeks of looking at the gospel and rock and roll. But the more I look at it and realize how many genres played into one another and where a lot of these influences came from, how fascinating it is. And I'll end every episode it's 9:30 now, so we're gonna wrap up. But I will ask everybody every week to think about some of the music you've listened to growing up, or that you listen to now, and where you realize that there's faith placed right into the words, and maybe you never really thought about it because you're just enjoying the music, yeah. But we're going to now start looking at, because I could go on for weeks just looking at the fascinating aspect of musical genres and how artists, like how closely they were related to. I mean, just knowing that Bob Dylan spent so much time in Nashville, I had no clue that Bob Dylan was that heavily influenced by the sound of Nashville and country music. So, and the fact that Willie Nelson got kicked out of Nashville, he
didn't fit their mold.
He didn't fit their mold, right? I mean, it's just, that aspect is just fascinating. So I need to purposely step away from that, because I'll go off on 100 different tangents. And I want to start looking at individual artists and how faith played into their music. And so if you have a request, if you have hey, could you look up, such and such a band or such an, I'll delve into, I'll see what I can find. But next week, with the invasion of British rock in America, I want to look at the Battle of the Beatles. Because after the Beatles broke up, we get to see a song of heaven and a song of hell. And we're going to look specifically at those two songs next week and the artist's influence based on that. What was culture, what was society doing to them at that point when they left the Beatles to write those two songs, a song of heaven and a song of hell. So that's it for this week. I went a couple minutes over, and I pray you all have a good week. If you make it up to the Grange Hall today for church at 11, there's no sermon. It's our fellowship day. Just come, have a meal, hang out. We have some good conversation. We will be setting up an online giving for the church. We're going to be doing a capital campaign for the Grange Hall because up here in the forest, that's about the only, this part of the National Forest is about the only community building that really exists. So we had our last community movie night. Coming up October 24th at 6 p.m. is the soup, supper, and dessert auction. And December 12th, we'll be doing a holiday movie. And other than that, we are worshiping live at 11 a.m. at the Grange Hall on Route 337, just down from Sandstone Springs. And as always, we'll be here Sunday mornings with Faith in the Forest podcast. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list, email me at pastork@tdutecreek.org. That will be getting updated soon. And check us out at tdutecreek.org. So have a blessed day, and I will see you, either at church or next week. Right here, 9 a.m. God bless.